mean, if that phone call didn't get made and the authorities didn't get involved, I don't think that I would be alive.
You're restricting their movement, you're forcing them to work. That's slavery.
Coming up on City Inside Out, human trafficking. The numbers are shocking. 2 million people get trapped into a life of forced labor and sex each year. Washington State was the first in the country to pass an anti-human trafficking law a decade ago. So why is the problem still growing?
I just am flabbergasted how human beings can treat other human beings.
How are anti-trafficking agencies working to help survivors and stop the people who enslave them in our city and around the world?
We have resources, but very limited. We're able to make prosecutions and get very serious sentences out of them.
Fighting human trafficking, next on City Inside Out. Welcome to City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. 150 years ago, our country celebrated what many consider the end of slavery with the Emancipation Proclamation. The sad truth is, a new type of slavery exists and is growing rapidly in our country and around the world. It's called human trafficking, a multi-billion-dollar business that involves people born in this country and others trapped in indentured servitude. What you're about to see is the story of 2 trafficking survivors and the people trying to help them, not just to mend their broken lives, but to stop what's become a worldwide disgrace. In our land of opportunity are thousands of people, some from half a world away, living a shattered dream.
He was a very wealthy white man that came to the village and pretty much promised my family that we were going to come to America for a better life, for a better education.
In the place where I'm from, it happens all the time. The people from my caste, they don't have this much education. They not even know what is human rights is.
These are the faces, some in the light, some in the shadows, of human trafficking. Many people believe the story of trafficking starts and ends here, with young girls selling themselves for sex on streets like Aurora Avenue.
Now she's walking up the other side of the street.
Captain Eric Sano, head of the Seattle Police Department's Coordinated Criminal Investigations Section, says domestic minor sex trafficking is a growing problem and a horrific one.
It's something that shocks our consciousness, right? We can't imagine that there are children out there, 11, 12, 13, that are being forced into the sex trade.
A 2008 study says as many as 500 young people in Greater Seattle are working as juvenile prostitutes. Police believe hundreds more are hiding behind new technology like virtual personal networks no regular search engine would ever find.
She's got the coat with the fur around the hoodie.
But the International Labor Organization says sex trafficking is just a fraction of a much larger problem. For every one person forced into the sex trade, 9 more are trapped in a life of labor.
Truly, forced labor trafficking is much greater throughout the country and in this area than sex trafficking. The sweatshops, the construction industry, domestic servitude, housekeeping in hotels and motels. There's a lot of that out there. The problem with that side is it's severely underreported.
We're literally beaten, raped. There was a lot of mental, sexual, physical abuse in that home. 9 of us living in a 2-bedroom house. And so that's how we came to America.
Khurshida Begum and 8 of her relatives, from infants to teenagers, were sold by their family in Bangladesh to a man from Oakville, Washington, and came to the U.S. in 1988.
We were extremely poor. We were in a village. We didn't have education, so this was like a ticket out from my father for us.
But what started as a promise of education and a new life turned into a nightmare of forced servitude on a farm.
We were pretty much enslaved there, threatened that if we ever left, we might be killed.
After about a year, one of Khurshida's cousins took her own life, which shocked the other kids into running to the home of a neighbor who called police.
I mean, if that phone call didn't get made and the authorities didn't get involved, I don't think that I would be alive. And I don't think any of my other family members would be alive either.
Kershida's trafficker was eventually given a 4-year prison sentence for indecent liberties, of which he served 18 months. Kershida has rebuilt her life with a career of educating the public about her experience, but she's one of the very few trafficking survivors who's overcome her fear.
I'm able to talk about it now because I want to be a voice for those who are voiceless.
Usually we don't cry as a man, but sometimes I cry a lot.
Sandeep, not his real name, says his life was in danger back home in India in 2008 after his father ran for political office.
Nobody tell me to go to America. I come by myself.
He fled to the U.S., hoping to land a job on the East Coast, but he was so distraught over his family back in India, he couldn't work.
I called my friend. I said I need some help.
That friend connected him to a man involved in the fast food industry who promised Sandeep a place to stay.
I trust them. I went with them because there's nothing else I can do.
What followed was 3 years of living with 4 other men in one room, locked from the outside. The man who took Sandeep in also took his passport and paid him for his work at a rate of $2 an hour.
I take all these abuses, but I still was thinking he's doing a favor for me because giving me a job, keeping me protected.
When his boss asked him to drive for what Sandeep says was an alien smuggling operation, Sandeep ran away. He ended up in Seattle and earned legal residency by cooperating with Homeland Security. But Sandeep is certain if his trafficker knew his location, he'd be killed.
They threaten us like that. They say, your body not even go to India.
Washington State is a leader in the fight against human trafficking, with forums such as these at the UW highlighting the work of pioneers like Dr. Sutapa Basu.
Sometimes I just am flabbergasted how human beings can treat other human beings.
Basu, a longtime advocate against sweatshops and mail-order brides, helped push for our state's law against human trafficking in 2003, the first of its kind in the country. But Basu says the real work is just beginning with trafficking, estimated to be a $32 to $36 billion business worldwide. And experts say trafficking will keep growing until contractors stop looking the other way when they hire cheap labor and when customers start demanding free trade goods.
The only way for us to eradicate this human trafficking is for the public to come together and deal with it at every level, from grassroots movements to policy making.
It is a worldwide problem that is happening in our own backyard. Some are fighting back.
I call it like it is. It's modern day slavery.
Some are still living in fear.
I'm always scared of them, even though the Homeland Security told me, hey, you protected.
But survivors of human trafficking say their experiences are not and cannot be just another headline.
Stop looking at these different stories as just stories.
It happens to me and I see it's happening still. It is happening still.
They are a call to action.
It's about prevention. It's about if you see something, you do something.
I don't care what happens to me. It's okay. I can be a start. So this can be over.
And joining us to discuss this topic, we have Yasmin Christopher. She's a Seattle U law student and also a survivor of human trafficking. Thank you for being with us. Also, we have Hao Wen, who is with the social service group API Chaya. Thank you for being here as well. We also have Assistant U.S. Attorney Kate Krisham. Thank you for your presence here. And finally, we have Velma Valoria, a former state legislator and longtime human rights activist. Thank you all for being here to discuss this very important topic and difficult topic, too. Yasmin, I want to start with you because your message as a survivor is such an important one. Kershida, the woman we just saw in the setup piece there and had that powerful message, I wanted to follow up on what her story is and what your story is as well. The man who took her, you, other members of your family to America, kept them on that farm is your father. And I want to talk about this, that moment when you and your family realized your father was not just a harsh man, an abusive man, but a human trafficker. What was that like?
Well, it was interesting how it came about. My Aunt Kershida had decided after a long time of being a single parent, being in the workforce, that she was going to go back to school, and she took this class about multicultural America. And it just so happened that the teacher was excellent at what she did and brought up the topic of human trafficking and its history in the United States. So in a much broader context, not just the sex trafficking issue that I was aware of from TV and from things like that, but she came to me and approached me and was like, I think what happened to our family actually has a name. And we discussed it a little bit, and I went and saw her speak on it. And I mean, it really took a lot for me to figure out how I was going to own that situation and that story, given that, you know, I was in law school and I was trying to embark on a professional career. But I realized also that these are the same issues that people often have with self-identifying, with abuse and trauma and things that happen to them. So I just decided, well, you know, a lot of people can dismiss the issue in a lot of different ways, but when they look at me, there's not a lot that they can argue with.
Yeah, I know, and this is a big part of your life. Thank you for sharing that with us. How I want to talk with you about some of the victims you work with in trafficking, and you work with the other victim we talked to in this piece, Sandeep, that we heard from. His story really spoke to two major challenges, I think, in stopping human trafficking. One, people trapped in a trafficking situation are very reluctant to come forward, which leads to problem two. It's very hard to identify who a human trafficker is. How do you try to break those barriers down? Help us understand the work that you and your agency do.
So I work at API Chaya, and we have a huge program, do community organizing. So we go out to the community and try to educate the community member, service providers, and policemen about what human trafficking really is, and telling the community that it's really happening in the community, and here are the services that are available for them, and helping people to really recognize the other people in the community that are victims of human trafficking.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. Thank you for that. Kate, let me move to you and talk about this issue. For as much as our state has been a leader when it comes to anti-human trafficking laws, I know for the first 5 years those laws were on the book, no charges were filed actually using those provisions there. And that is starting to change, but the message I keep hearing from survivors is this: we need our government to do more to stop these criminals. I just need to know, are you making a dent with this issue here in the Seattle area? Tell us about some of your cases, some of the challenges in prosecuting them.
Sure. I work for the U.S. Department of Justice, so we prosecute cases under the federal laws. And fortunately, we have a really great act called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which empowers us to go after traffickers. With regards to sex trafficking, very stiff mandatory minimum sentences. With regards to labor trafficking and human trafficking cases, maximum sentences of up to 20 years. The sentencing guidelines take these crimes very seriously, and we're able to make prosecutions and get very serious sentences out of them. Yeah.
That's a big piece of it, but I know it's a high bar that you really do have to meet that federal charges level. Is that right?
It is. You know, we work really in conjunction with the King County prosecuting attorneys, and we work a lot with task force officers, federal agencies as well, to determine whether or not a case is appropriate for federal prosecution. Right. And there have been a number of them we have taken. Various considerations, if there are minors involved,
right.
If there are people being trapped across state lines, that's something that our office takes a look at. If there's particularly violent trafficking going on. Right. So all of those are very appropriate for federal prosecution.
Thank you very much for that, Kate. Velma, let me talk to you about this. You were a state legislator from 1992 to 2004 and were instrumental in getting our state's trafficking laws established. You're still advocating, of course, for survivors and raising awareness about this issue. How would you say an average person would be able to recognize when they see a trafficking situation? What does that look like?
Recognition?
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult because they could be, like you said, everyday workers. But I think there's issues of, for example, the safety violations. If they're placed in a place where there are, like you said, what the film was saying, 13 people and it's a locked door.
Right.
When they've taken the passport away, usually they will go to somebody like API Chaya and say, you know, I'm having trouble because, you know, then they name all those different reasons, and then that's where we're able to identify them.
Okay, so you see something that looks out of the ordinary in terms of safety is what you're saying. Okay, all right, thank you for that. Yasmin, I want to talk about the fact that you've decided to give your voice to this campaign launched by Seattle and King County to raise awareness about this issue, let people know how they can help. These ads, I should say, we've seen on the sides of metro buses, for example. How effective has that been, do you think? Is that message sinking in? I've talked to a few people on the street who still don't really know what human trafficking is, and I wanted to get your take on it. Is that message hitting home?
Well, I think that, Washington's done a great job in terms of law and policy. I think that there's a framework. There are direct service providers that are doing really good work, but I think it's become a very over-sensationalized topic, and I think that's caused a rift between the public's perception of trafficking as it is, which is modern-day slavery. So I think that it's good that it's out there, and I know that calls to the direct service line, the hotline in particular, have been increasing since that campaign's been out there. But I think until you make that connection between people and people,
Yeah.
you know, it's not going to work as effectively as it could or should.
Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, Velma?
Well, yeah, and I was going to say people won't raise their hand and say, hey, I've been trafficked, right? Because of the conditions that they're under. So it's going to be difficult for people to come up, right? So that's for us is what's going on. And then the other thing when she's talking about sensationalism is that we're not looking at the root causes of what what trafficking is about. It's for us in the Filipino community, and the reason why I put it forward had a lot to do with what we call the push and the pull factor. So they get pushed out of the country from where they live because there are no economic opportunities. They get pulled into the United States or a developed country because that's what they see. They think that there's all these opportunities, and then they become really vulnerable to what's going on.
Right. Very good point. Thank you for that, Velma. How I want to talk to you about this, because even in a best case scenario, let's say a trafficker is caught and prosecuted here, the survivor left behind has a very difficult time finding a place in our society. The survivors I've talked to were speaking about the fact that they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And police say that's right. When they talk to them, it feels like they're dealing with a prisoner of war almost. I just want to talk about this. How do you help survivors make that transition back into a quote-unquote normal life? And are the resources there for that to happen?
We have resources, but very limited, and we try to meet the client at where they're at. I serve clients from not speak any English and never been to any school before and not knowing how to read and write both in their language and in English. So some clients take a long time to move forward. We try to support very basic needs that they like very basic. I hope to be able to do more, but we only have very limited funding to provide a safe place for them and food, shelter, connect them to mental health counselor, connect them to a lawyer to represent them. And
how long does that process take?
As I say, it really depends on where they're at. Some people already finished college in their country or they speak English, which is helping them move forward a lot faster. Some people never been into school before.
I see.
But the average that I can say is taking about 2 to 3 years.
Wow, that is a long time for that to happen. Kate, let me bring you back in here, because I know sometimes even when you are able to prosecute a case, these trafficking survivors find a way back into life that you've been trying to get them out of. I'm thinking of some of the sex trafficking cases where young girls who've worked for years in prostitution, I should say, are sometimes drawn back into that because it's all they know. Is there a way to stop that cycle somehow? What do you think?
Well, that's what our goal is. And at our office, we do take a victim-centered approach, which is that we don't view the people who've been trafficked as criminals who are breaking the law. They're victims. And we get them set up with victim services. We also, here in Washington, we have a partnership with API Chaya, with the International Rescue Committee, and those organizations that are really well equipped to help victims. Okay. So we guide them through that process. Okay. And we try to do all that we can on the federal side, but also set them up with organizations whose specialty it is to work with victims.
Collaborating with them, good to hear. Velma, I wanted to talk to you about just the fact we've been mentioning a lot of different countries that might be involved with this, but this is unfortunately a homegrown situation too in terms of trafficking that happens here in the U.S. with people who are U.S. citizens. Can you help us with how a young person that might be from a well-to-do home in Seattle might be trapped in a trafficking situation just like a person who comes from an impoverished home in a third world country, let's say? I don't think they're the exact same story, but there are some factors there that do match up.
So let me tell you how the law came about here in the state of Washington. There were several mail-order brides that came to this country, and one of them was this woman named Susana Rimarata Blackwell. She was murdered inside the King County Courthouse, right? And then there was another woman, University of Washington student, Anastasia King from Kyrgyzstan. So I'm not saying that all mail-order brides are vulnerable to trafficking. What I'm saying is that there are certain issues. It's again the push and pull factor, right? When the whole Soviet Union dispersed and each country became economically independent, there were a lot of economic factors, and a lot of people look to go abroad. And one of the ways to go abroad is to marry somebody who's a citizen in a particular country. In this case, it was a citizen in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And so then what happens is that they get involved with people who are kind of like generally isolated from general society.
Sure.
And then the women get abused, their passports get taken away, and so then they become vulnerable. They don't have a support system in this country. So then when they begin to become independent, like a University of Washington from Kyrgyzstan student, right? She becomes to be independent, then the men become frustrated.
That's the pull. Okay.
Yeah.
You're talking about the push and then the pull coming
Right.
from the outside forces. Thank you very much for that. Yasmin, I want to shift our conversation a little bit more to this idea of prevention, how we can stop this issue of trafficking before it happens. So you're studying law at Seattle U right now. You've been talking about this from a few different fronts. I know advocating for immigration reform and also fighting back against trafficking too. What changes are you hoping to make in our legal system and our immigration system that might have an impact on human trafficking in some way?
Well, more recently, I've been involved with an organization called We Belong Together, which frames the immigration movement as a women's rights issue. And I think when we speak particularly for the mail order bride, for instance, oftentimes these women are tied to their husbands for their visas. And so how do we approach those situations, address these, and it's domestic work as well. A majority of domestic workers are women, and a majority of those are vulnerable to exploitation for a number of the reasons that we've already discussed. So I think for me, that immigration piece is very important. To go back into that, if we're going to talk about prevention, to me, you have to look at systemic issues of human exploitation. And that's what got me involved in immigration in the first place, this is a system that we use now, where we justify exploitation in a lot of different ways. And so the perception, like you were addressing asking the question earlier about why people kind of go back into the life, I think the reasons are also similar for labor and sex trafficking. And for a survivor to come forward and admit what has happened to them, there's a lot of pain and anxiety because of society's perception of them. And I think that's true for immigrants or people surviving sex work or commercial sex work. I think that those two things, we have to look at that. We have to understand why we think certain people are more deserving in certain areas than others. And that's a really deep internal thing that stems from, colonialism, if you want to go back that far.
Certainly
so.
could. Yeah. And did you have something, Val?
Yeah, and it's even beyond just the issue of colonialism, but natural disasters. For example, what has happened in the Philippines with the typhoon, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people become really vulnerable. So if I was a recruiter, I would go into that area and bring people and promise them jobs, right? Yeah. And of course, you'd want to get out of that situation.
Right.
So we also really need to think about those natural disasters that can create a vulnerable workforce.
I think if you go into low-income areas in the United States, you'll definitely see the connection between sex trafficking and impoverished areas. Yeah. Just like if you look internationally, there's definitely a distinction. I mean, you heard my aunt referring to the way that my dad was able to come in and use his power and authority on a family that really was not really equipped to even understand what that meant.
How I wanted to talk a little bit about API Chaya and what you do to work with different cultures that are out there, because unfortunately in some of these situations it is a son-in-law that is enslaving a father-in-law. It happens within families there. You're breaking down a lot of different cultural barriers to try to solve this issue here. Can you talk to us about that, how you do that, how you're able to do something like that?
Obviously, I don't speak every language and I'm not an expert in every culture, but because we came out root in the community that's seeing a lot of clients from different cultural background, we want to be very mindful and really respectful to every single culture. And every time I have a client from a different culture, the first thing that I do is to do research about where they come from and what kind of political or what kind of situation of that country is going on, and trying to meet them at where they at, and really knowing that I am not the expert and not knowing their culture enough. So want to be open-minded and try to step back and really admit that I am not the expert in their life and trying to let them lead their life, but I am the supporter behind them.
Okay, important to have that. And Kate, I wanted to bring you in here because I think one of the big challenges is policemen, firefighters, some of our first responders, some of them know what's going on, but then others might not. That domestic violence case actually might be something more. Help us with that, because I think a lot of officers out there might need some extra training. Are they getting it? Are they not? What's your office doing?
There are protocols that are going to be rolled out throughout the state for precisely that reason, so that people on the ground, patrol officers, someone that might go into a restaurant to check out some sort of complaint, can recognize if something is a bit amiss and do further investigation on it.
Okay. All right. I know that's going to be coming. Thank you very much for that. We're just about out of time, but Velma, I wanted to talk quickly about the supply chain issue, which I know you've talked about quite a bit, because a big part of this is the demand for cheap goods in our country and others. Or cheap labor. Well, they're all connected there. Help us with that, because I think a lot of people might unwittingly be contributing to this problem.
So, you know, we've done a lot of education in the public, but I think what's missing is the part about the corporations. And so, for example, I was looking at Microsoft, right? They're bringing in people from abroad, from India, because many of those people have the skills and they also speak English, right? But I was looking at the international trade agreements, and it says that, you know, these countries or these corporations have the right to bring in people and give them a 5-year visa, right? So at the end of 5 years, what happens? Do they have access to the other markets? In the Filipino community, they did that with the nurses, right? And the hospitals didn't have any accountability. They would give them a 2-year working visa. At the end of 2 years, they would take their visa away because they did not pass the state board examination. So what happens? They go underground.
Yeah, a lot of changes are on their way for that part of the situation. Thank you very much for that. Yasmin, we need to wrap up here, and I know your aunt spoke to this issue. I'd like to get your take on it too. I think it's difficult for a lot of people to get past that shock of a human trafficking story. They focus on the details of that story and not this larger call to action. How can you get people not just to pay attention to human trafficking, but do something about it?
Well, I think a lot of people first need to assess what is motivating them to do something about it. I think getting away from this sort of savior complex that is so inherent in this movement that people, and it's fine. It's you know, it is, when you hear painful stories, you do feel this call to action. But I think supporting organizations like API Chaya that have the framework to properly work with survivors, I think would be, to me, you know, essential in doing that. It doesn't mean that you know, snoop around and become an agent and discover someone and rescue someone, and then, because what I realized upon telling the story is one part of somebody's life, but their story doesn't end when that little sensational piece has happened to them. So I think talking about meeting people where they're at, understanding where your position is in society and how you might be able to use your privilege, but doing it in a cultural and respectfully appropriate way. So connecting with people that are already doing fantastic work. You know, I think for me in Seattle, a critique that I would say is that there's this sort of inherent nonprofit industrial complex that's happening, and I think there's a big grab for resources instead of understanding where the gaps are and how we can, you know, work to support organizations that are already doing fantastic things.
And work together. Thank you very much for that. Thank you all, and we will be right back.
It's really sad, you know, that a lot of these people come from the other countries looking for something more, and they get stuck in this, you know, cycle that they can't get out of.
I know that it's a global problem, but I don't know specifically about in Seattle.
You just got to keep saying something. You got to, you know, keep voicing your opinion about it.
We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter and give us your feedback. Before we close today, we want to tell you how to contact the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. That number is 1-888-3737-888. You can also learn more about this issue and how to get involved at our website, seattlechannel.org/cityinsideout. While you're there, you can watch any of our programs online anytime. Coming up next time, helping the homeless in Seattle. The 10-year plan to end homelessness is faltering, and local agencies are taking a hard look at what to do next. We bring you the latest details next time on City Inside Out. I hope you join us.